A journalist wrote an article in a national British newspaper, The Observer, which is a sister to The Guardian, and it caused a bit of an uproar. This video will discuss what happened, why people reacted the way they did, and some of the larger consequences of reporting like this. But if you're not in the edu Twitter or education Twitter space, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. A quick preface before I carry on: do be respectful of anyone or anything mentioned in this video. The intention of this video is to shine light on a discussion and related topics, not to point a finger for people to go and do online stupid stuff with. But this article by Anna tells a story about a London school, more specifically the head teacher's journey. Teachers, head teachers, and anyone working in the education sector have a tough job. Resources, money, child behaviour are all increasing stressors, so anyone working in the education sector, thank you. And this article does cover some of the things that people working in the education sector need to wrestle with. But the head teacher's story isn't why people got frustrated. It was the facts, or non-facts, claims, or opinions, and general underlying assumptions made throughout the article that caused a lot of the frustrations. I read this article before seeing all of this criticism, and I had to do some of my own research because some of the claims that they were making were a bit bold. Most of my research is done in academic texts, and I think this piece is a reason why I try and avoid educational journalism. The head teacher joins this school in 2018. The article says there were around 300 suspensions the year before they joined. An exclusion is when a student is asked to permanently leave a school. A temporary exclusion was a few days where you can't go to school, and that's now called a suspension. Headcount has gone from around 800 to 380, with somewhat expected drops in suspensions and exclusions. There are less students, so I would expect there to be less suspensions and less exclusions. So if we look at the rates instead of the raw numbers, we see an initial drop in the first year or two, but then it goes back up even though the headcount is still going down. After I made this graph for my own understanding, I found that Andrew Old has actually done the same thing. So it wasn't just me confused about the story and going to look at the numbers. This story of a school going from rags to riches seemed to be lacking a bit of context. The shared numbers didn't seem to tell the entire story. And I don't want to speculate about what's going on or what happened in the school, but this lack of context continues throughout the article when they start talking about behaviour and ideas around suspensions and exclusions. From what I can see, the London's Violence Reduction Unit, VRU, try and reduce rates of violence and understand the causes, early prevention being one of its main goals, which obviously relates directly with schools. Anna points out the head teacher said his school was far less safe when suspensions were really high. Suggesting high suspensions means a school is unsafe. Suspensions then being linked with exclusions. But correlation isn't causation. A reminder, the suspension numbers dropped with the headcount dropping. And this school actually had a 14.49 suspension rate in the academic year of 21 to 22, which, as Andrew points out, was actually above the national average of 13.96. The exclusion rate of 0.47 also above the national average of 0.16. Yeah, they improved, but still have room to go, and there's limited explanation as to why those numbers did go down in the article. But the reasons are the important thing. Schools just don't magically get better. Things need to happen. Anna discusses a soft approach to discipline, talking about refocus rooms, fun, less punitive rooms. Punitive being intended as a punishment. These refocus rooms being walls filled with colourful artwork. But that sounds like an isolation room to me, something I thought most schools with behaviour systems had anyway. The school I went to like 10 years ago had them, even with the pretty colours and the artwork and stuff on the walls. I would argue the isolation room was actually more fun to be in than the classroom. But the difference here isn't the room itself, it's the approach taken, the less punitive approach, which is where Anna calls out Tom Bennett. The attempt to drive down exclusions has some fierce detractors. They include the government's own behaviour TSAR for England, Tom Bennett, a vocal supporter of tough discipline and silent corridors. A couple of points to note here: drive down exclusions, but how? Tough discipline means what? She then goes on to say the head teacher describes Bennett's comments as the sort of unevidenced thing you hear from people who haven't actually spent time teaching in schools. But Anna didn't say anything else on that point. This suggests Tom Bennett is unevidenced. Not a good look for a government educational professional. Understandably, Tom reacted and he said he has worked in tough inner city schools in London for over a decade. I visited 950 plus schools. I'm a professor in school behaviour, written 4 books on behaviour, and led national programmes of school improvement in school culture. None of which means I'm right, but I think I've earned the right to claim some level of expertise. To which I agree. An article reaching thousands of readers should include that sort of context and base level of research, in my opinion, especially after including a quote that suggests someone is unevidenced. Referring to the tough discipline, Tom, like me, wasn't really sure what was meant by tough. He said, I suspect tough in this context is intended to mean highly punitive, which I am certainly not an advocate of, but you would need to be familiar with my work to know that. And as Anna doesn't talk about Tom in any way or reference his work in any way, she puts it down to the readers. Readers then needing to do their own research, but I would argue that's the journalist's job. Of course, mistakes can be made, improvements worked on, but I would have thought someone doing an article for a national newspaper would have had, peer review to try and get through or iron out some of these issues before it goes public. When referring to driving down exclusion rates, schools could do that by just not excluding children. But I imagine if you do that, managing really poor behaviour would be quite difficult, which is probably why the school still do suspend and exclude children. Tom Bennett has said, multiple times if you follow his work, the way to reduce exclusions is by reducing the need to exclude, not by simply turning the tap off. However, turning off the tap is what this article seems to be suggesting. One quote Anna used said, if they just kick you out of school, people carry on misbehaving, but here they give people a chance to fix their ways. So how and why schools lower exclusion rates is really what this article is talking about. And that is why some people have argued this article is more activism than journalism because it's talking mainly about one specific perspective. For further context, the school discussed has a low headcount, but it has also been reported to be lowering the Year 7 intake. That's 11 to 12-year-olds, and that's going from 180 to 120. Of the 381 pupils, 86 sat their GCSEs in 2013, so leaving the school. And with a max intake of 120, I don't see that headcount increasing much. As Andrew mentions in his blog, an ordinary 11 to 16 secondary school in London with 381 pupils can probably be considered to be at risk of closure. Anna also mentions that almost 70% of the pupils are on free school meals, which is well above the national average of 24%. They set up crowdfunding to help the students pay for their school uniforms. Large numbers of families are refugees and asylum seekers crammed into temporary rooms in hotels. So to me, this isn't a school I would choose to use as a role model for behaviour policy. Increased grade performance was used as a way to support the claims about improving behaviour, but when you look at the government numbers, the school is below average. The school is lower on all of the metrics here, and when you look at the Progress 8 scores, they are in the 15% of mainstream schools, well below average. Andrew Old, again doing some great work, went and found their old Progress 8 scores. He writes, as you can see, the school's P8 results do not resemble the head's story of atrocious results in 2017 and improvement after he arrived in 2018. For those confused, if you look here, there is a range. You want the number to be bigger. To me, those Progress 8 scores don't look like significant improvement. However, Ofsted did give an improvement of the behaviour score from 2019 to 2022. Ofsted testing educational systems in England, and they're not without their own issues, as I discussed before, but behaviour improvements. How? What did they do? A space to talk about emotions. Not unique to this school. Programmes rewarding good behaviour. Not unique to this school. Students feeling like someone was listening. Again, not unique to this school. Anna says, In some of the strictest academy chains, as pupils scale what is known as the behaviour ladder, notching up detentions leads to time in an isolation room where they sit in a booth facing the wall all day as they work or perform tasks such as copying out dictionary definitions in complete silence. I left school over a decade ago and my school didn't do that. Reading and listening to other conversations between teachers and students and people that have graduated, there doesn't seem to be many schools that do that. do. I could be wrong, but this sounds like a claim that is either outdated or so narrow on a sample size of schools that I'm not sure that you can say this school is doing anything uniquely different. And for clarity, that isn't what Tom Bennett promotes, to my understanding at least. But the way the article is written, that is what your interpretation as the reader could be. It was when I first read it. This school sounds like they've made some changes, but the changes don't seem to be unique to that school. They seem to be well adopted across England at least, and I would really question why the school is used as an example for behaviour policy. Tom Rogers is someone that talks about teachers and education on Twitter a lot. They did a Twitter poll and almost 4,500 people responded, and almost half of them said that they were assaulted. These are likely teachers being assaulted by students or parents. That is high. So when I read this that Anna put in her article, teachers can be your friend here. Why are these assault numbers so high? Assault sounds serious, and it is. It could be a consequence of the management systems inside of schools. Various reports discuss punishments, like this one from the BBC. Instead of a detention, he says a teacher or staff member will sit with the child and talk through what they did, why they did it, what emotions led to it, and what they could do differently. Anna reports something similar. This morning they are sitting at a table in the middle discussing a book that Amanda O'Connor, the room's coordinator, is reading to them. The book is Holds, a comic novel about a bleak children's correctional boot camp in the Texas desert. So a child misbehaves, gets sent to the isolation room or whatever you want to call it. They then talk about it and listen to someone read them a book and are then expected not to misbehave. If that is it, I personally have my doubts as to how effective that would be. Anna reports the head teacher saying, often poor behaviour is a child saying, notice me, help me. But it could be them just messing around because it's fun. Or because there aren't really any serious consequences as to why to not do whatever it is that they are doing. Children test the limits, they push your buttons, they certainly did when I was coaching. With my limited expertise in school behaviour systems, I'm going to leave the advice down to people like Tom Bennett who have the expertise. Much of my research in the academic literature and my own experience aligns with many of the things I've seen him suggest, but this is where the article takes a little bit of a turn and we start talking about facts about crime, and specifically knife crime. Some quotes from Anna's article. There is a clear correlation between children with a history of suspension or exclusion and violence. There is also evidence that children excluded from school are more likely to commit crimes when they are adults. 1 in every 2 people in prison were excluded as children, according to research by the Institute for Public Policy Research think tank. Lib Peck, the VRU's director, says kids out of school are twice as likely to carry a knife. They might get caught up in a gang or exploitation. They might just think a knife will make them safer. We know it will put them more at risk. But correlation isn't causation, and I want more context here. A somewhat running theme throughout this article, but there are 2 claimed facts here. 1 in every 2 people in prison were excluded as children. Kids out of school are twice as likely to be carrying a knife. What does the data say? Again, this is where transparency of online communication would be really nice. I've spoken about this at length, like 4 hours, but please just cite your sources. It makes life so much easier for the reader. But off to the government website I go. Again. Wait, what does that say? Knife possession offences rarely followed exclusions. Although it is not possible to identify from this analysis whether there is an association between exclusions and knife possession offending, the low volumes of knife possession offences following exclusions mean any such association could not be a significant driver of youth knife possession offending overall. So correlation, not causation. I also did a little bit of browsing around the educator blog space to see if other people had written about it, and Yes, Andrew has written about it before. Of the 222 permanent exclusions of the year 22-23, 7% of them were for use or threat of use of an offensive weapon or prohibited item, likely a knife. But less serious offences could have been put in the 4,588 suspensions in the related categories. The VRU have a published inclusion charter, and in it says, an Ofsted report on knife crime showed that children excluded from school are twice as likely to carry a knife, while data also highlights that almost 1 in 2 of the prison population were excluded as children. Okay, so maybe a source to those claimed facts. I went looking for the Ofsted report before reading Andrew's blog, and it is there. If you go down to the bottom and zoom in a lot, there it is. However, it doesn't support the fact. This is the best quote I could find. Research also shows that pupils who self-report as being a victim of knife crime are twice as likely to carry a knife themselves compared with non-victims, which seems a bit of a stretch to apply to everyone, and Andrew actually picks out a different section. Children who were excluded from school to PRUs, pupil referral units, have self-reported higher instances of knife carrying than children who are not excluded. But I think Andrew and I are thinking the same thing when we read this. Excluded children. 7% almost certainly have already been caught carrying a knife at school, that's why they were permanently excluded, are only twice as likely to carry a knife. Take 100 students, 7 of them have almost certainly already been caught carrying a knife, so 43 of the remaining 93 are likely to be carrying a knife. As Andrew says, considering that excluded pupils are mostly teenage boys and disproportionately from disadvantaged backgrounds, makes the statistics seem low. So I'm not entirely sure this stat supports the claim that 1 in 2 children are likely carrying a knife out of school. And if you go looking for a percentage in the report, the only one you can really find is this. When looking at PRU attendees, 47%, 92 of 196, say they know someone who has carried a knife with them, compared with 25% of non-PRU attendees, 1,188 of 4,673. But attending a PRU isn't being out of school. Going to a PRU isn't the same as being excluded from school. Not all students in PRUs were excluded, and not all students in PRUs are there because of their poor behaviour. But it is where many students displaying violent or criminal behaviour are sent and do go, so you would expect those numbers to be higher than average anyway. 196 as a sample size is also kinda small, so this fact or stat is just really poorly supported. What about the prison stat? Back to the huge VRU footnotes, we can see that there is a prison report, which is actually directions to a blog post which says 1 in 2 prison inmates were excluded when at school. But it does reference the report with a broken link. But after some searching on the internet, you can find the report, and it says, the majority of UK prisoners were excluded from school. A longitudinal study of prisoners found that 63% of prisoners reported being temporarily excluded when at school. Temporary exclusions are now suspensions, so if you were to use the 63% stat, that will be extremely misrepresentative and very misleading, but it does continue to say 42% had been permanently excluded, and these excluded prisoners were more likely to be repeat offenders than other prisoners. So 42%, not quite half or 1 in 2, but the 2012 study asked the prisoners about their exclusion rates, which does bring into question the reliability, one, of the answers, and 2, the meaning behind exclusion, as the word exclusion and suspension could mean different things if you're talking to adults that it could have been an exclusion back then. So I'm not sure how trustworthy these results might actually be. So I went looking for more recent and potentially more rigorous data, and the best I could find at a quick search was a young offenders report in 2022. Yes, I know that's limited as a sample group, but in theory it should hold to around half or 50%, like 1 in 2. Overall, 10% of children who had been cautioned or sentenced for an offence had been permanently excluded, compared with 15% of children who had been cautioned or sentenced for a serious violence offence. But that's just violent offences. What about the other offences? Looking at this graph, it hovers around 20%. And you may notice the slow drop with suspension numbers over time, reaching 24 months in this case. Although there is a relationship between being permanently excluded and being cautioned or sentenced for a serious violence offence, there is often a significant time lag between those two events. This makes me question how closely related a permanent exclusion and an offence is. Is this causation or correlation? Just scrolling through the document, this figure also caught my attention. The persistent absence is very high here. Yes, repeated suspension could contribute, but with the attendance crisis right now in schools, this is a worrying figure. So looking at the two facts that were used in the article, 1 in every 2 people in prison were excluded is misleading at best. Then kids out of school are twice as likely to be carrying a knife is just false. There is no supporting data that I found, at least. Unless I'm misunderstanding something, of course, in which case let me know in the comment section. Teacher assault is a serious problem, and suspensions and exclusions are part of the behaviour system to help protect both teachers and students. So publishing an article about the school that stopped excluding pupils and restored calm is first not true, as the school still excludes students, but is also dangerously misleading by using false facts to support a particular narrative. And as leaders and policies use stories like these to try and educate themselves about what they should do in the education sector, this has serious consequences for those involved in the sector, specifically teachers, which is where a lot of the uproar came from. Faulty journalism is something I see all over the internet, and this video is a case study of faulty YouTube journalism that I think covers many of the themes I seem to see online, both in video and in written articles. Feel free to correct me or disagree with me inside the comment section below.